Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 15th day of January in the year 2017. It is the day that we celebrate the birth of Martin Luther King, and it is a national holiday. As many of you know, post offices and banks and schools and that kind of thing are closed, and there are celebrations, many celebrations going on around the country. There are protest meetings, and of course, all of this is happening in the backdrop, against the backdrop of the fact that the inauguration is 4 days away this Friday. And as many of you probably know, a kerfuffle has emerged, as of the end of last week, between the civil rights leader John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis of Georgia, and the president-elect Donald Trump, and it has gotten fairly hostile. It has created quite a backlash within the African American community, and again, a lot of the media folks are focusing on this as indicative of what many see as something we're likely to continue seeing into the administration of this president-elect, which is his thin skin and his ability to not take lightly any criticism. He apparently feels the need to respond, and sometimes respond very harshly, and oftentimes it leads into something that becomes bigger than it was at the very beginning, and that's, I think, what this may have become. But on the other hand, John Lewis made the statement on Friday that he really did not. Actually, it was a session for 60 Minutes on Sunday night, and it was basically his statement that he did not think that Donald Trump would be a legitimate president, because he felt that the Russian hacking had pretty much worked in his favor and had done serious damage to the campaign of his competitor. And so therefore he raised questions about the legitimacy of this presidency. And of course, as we know, that's one of the issues that that Donald Trump has reacted most strongly to. He has pretty much since the election, he has basically confronted or dealt with everything that seems to even hint at the possibility that his victory is questionable, with a very, very pointed, strong response. And that's what he did in this particular case. But again, in this particular case, John Lewis did say straight up that he didn't think that his presidency was legitimate. And so that kind of flew right directly in in Mr. Trump's wheelhouse, and he responded as he has in the past on other issues as well. But anyway, today is Martin Luther King Day. It is a holiday for many people, and my guess is that we do have folks listening to the program today that may not be able to listen live on other days. And if that is indeed true, let me welcome you to the program live, and let me invite you to take advantage of the fact that you're able to listen live today by becoming actively involved in the program, by picking up the phone and sharing your thoughts and your ideas with not only with me, but with our other listeners as well. We have a phone number, and it is reserved just for that purpose of enabling you to get on the air with your thoughts, your ideas, concerns, questions, whatever. The number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to to communicate one-on-one with me via email. And I know there are some people that are just reluctant to call in to a live broadcast of any kind. I can understand that. If you'd like to share your thoughts or your ideas with me one-on-one in an email, I'd love to hear from you. I commit to the fact that I will do the very best I can first to acknowledge the receipt of your email, but more importantly, depending on what is in it, if it seems like something that our other listeners here at the Virtual Center ought to know about and would indeed derive benefit from, then I'd like to, with your permission, share it. We don't have to necessarily have to identify you as the author. I can just basically say it was an email from a listener and let it go at that. But the most important thing is to get your thoughts and your ideas on the air so other people can weigh them, reflect upon them, and take advantage of them. My email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And I'd also like to make our listeners aware of our Facebook page. We've had it now for several, 8 or 9 months, I guess. We've used it. I've used it as in fact, my wife made a comment last night suggesting that I ought to do some sort of a blog, and I kind of suggested that the Facebook page is, at least that's the way I look upon it, is an opportunity to share thoughts or reactions or ideas to some of the issues of the day and put them out there so other people can react to them as well. At least that's been my plan. That's been my strategy. And over the last 3 or 4 days, I indeed have put a couple of things on Facebook, links to articles and other things. If you are a regular user of Facebook page, you know how easy it is to get on the Facebook page. Just go to the homepage, facebook.com, and on the homepage near the top there's a search box. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. And on there I have, as I say, I've posted 2 or 3 things over the last several days that I think if you haven't looked at them, that you might find interesting. In fact, there are a couple of those that I want to address in today's program. One I'd address at the beginning. The other I'd like to save for what I think will be our second hour program, because it relates to the issue of free press, which, if you were with us last Wednesday, you know that that's the issue that we really closed out our week's programming with last week, was the controversy between Donald Trump and the media as expressed in his press conference last week. You'll remember that President Obama gave his farewell address to the nation on Tuesday evening last week. Donald Trump followed at 11 a.m. the next morning with his first press conference since July. And in that press conference, as you'll recall, he really took issue with the media. More specifically with CNN and with BuzzFeed over the publication of a 35-page private memorandum that professed to claim an awful lot of very embarrassing information on Mr. Trump. And the fact of the matter is, we found out after the fact that particular report has been floating around and has been on the desks of many of the media leaders, the most prominent newspapers and journals in the country, for some time. There really hasn't been any way to validate the accuracy of what's in it, so therefore nobody printed it. However, it became clear last week that during one of the infrequent briefings from the intelligence community that Mr. Trump agreed to, mention of this report and some of the negative things in it was shared not only with Mr. Trump, but with outgoing President Obama as well. And in fact, the intelligence community put together a 2-page abbreviated summary of some of the issues in the lengthy report, CNN chose to publish that 2-page summary. And CNN's argument was that it really made news because it had been delivered as part of a briefing to the president and to the president-elect. And therefore that made it news. And Donald Trump reacted negatively to all of this, said it was fake journalism. If you remember, during the press conference, he refused to call on Mr. Acosta, the reporter who was there from CNN, accused him of fake news, said he wasn't going to call on him, he wasn't going to give him the opportunity to ask a question, and then launched into this attack on the media. And that, if you'll recall, was really the issue that we focused on in last Wednesday's program when we closed the week. Since that time, there have been a number of pieces on that particular controversy, and one of them appeared in the New York Times. If perhaps not last Wednesday, it could have been Thursday or Friday. I thought it did a very good job in explaining the issue, but more important, in highlighting the potential danger of this controversy to the whole issue of freedom of the press. And I put a link to the article on our Facebook page and wrote a few things about it, which I'd like to share with you today. And then beyond that, I've done some things and a little bit of research since then, which I'd like to share with you. I think this might be better reserved or better withheld for the second hour of our program today. At least that's my plan. But again, if you have thoughts on these issues or other issues, whether it's the controversy with John Lewis, whether it's the issue of freedom of the press, whatever it might be, then I really believe this kind of a program, especially as we often do on the first program each week, this is going to be one of those programs which deals with 3 or 4 different issues. So the opportunity is quite ripe, is quite available for you to basically use this opportunity to share your thoughts on your ideas on one or more of these issues with our listeners. And again, I remind you of our phone number, 304-663-4676. One of the issues that I put on Facebook last week was an article that appeared, I believe, let me verify what I'm going to say before I say it. It was in the New York Times. I wasn't sure. It was an article by Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, a Democrat of Oregon. And in it, Senator Wyden took on Mr. Trump's refusal to release his tax returns and talked about the importance of this particular issue. I put the link on our Facebook page with a few paragraphs, a few comments of my own, primarily because not only do I think the issue is important, but I also think that Ron Wyden did what I thought was a creditable job, looking at the background of this particular issue, looking at some of the behavior and some of the things that have occurred during the transition period since the election. I thought it was a very, very good summary on his part of some of the issues leading up to the question of the tax return and Mr. Trump's refusal to release his tax returns on the justification that his returns were being audited by IRS. And as he did throughout the campaign, his position was and is, when the audit is completed, I will indeed release my tax returns, but not until then. Mr. Wyden pointed out, and I pointed out in my comments, that it's become very clear that that particular excuse, the audit, really doesn't hold a whole lot of water for a couple of reasons. One is that IRS has made it very clear that numerous times in the past, tax returns have been made public by other politicians running for office, even though they were in the midst of an audit. And IRS explicitly gave Mr. Trump permission to release the tax returns, despite the fact that there's an ongoing audit. The reason that Senator Wyden is making such an issue of this is the reason he wrote this article, and is the reason I recommended it and put reference to it, put the link to it on our Facebook page. And that is that the argument about the audit is a little bit questionable this late in the game, because Wyden points out that when Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president, he did so knowing what the rules of the game were. And one of the things that has always been, or in recent years been, associated with a candidacy for the presidency is the release of tax returns. Wyden points out that Mr. Trump knew that when he declared for the office. Most people, very honestly, during the campaign, didn't make a whole lot of that particular issue, because most of the polls and most of the media were predicting that Donald Trump wasn't going to win anyway, so therefore it really didn't matter. But once he won the election, once he became the nominee in last July, and once he won the election in November, then suddenly the issue of the tax returns became a major issue. And as Senator Wyden reports in his article, Mr. Trump chose to run for president. He won and is about to assume office as the most powerful man in the world. His responsibility now is the American people, not his family, his companies, or his own bottom line, unquote. Wyden's position is that while he understands Mr. Trump's desire to shield his family and his private affairs and his businesses and everything else from scrutiny, once he became the president-elect, his responsibilities are about to change. As of this Friday, when he takes the oath of office, his principal responsibility will be to the American people. And Wyden argues that shift in his responsibilities makes his refusal to release the tax returns kind of an empty excuse. There's one other issue here, and this is my own, and I just put it on there. But it seems to me, and I can't really understand, and I believe I've mentioned this before, why the IRS hasn't chosen to expedite this audit. Given the fact that we're talking about the president-elect who'll be inaugurated as president of the United States in 4 days, and knowing that Mr. Trump is refusing to release his tax returns because of the audit, one would think it would behoove the IRS to take that excuse away from Mr. Trump by expediting the audit, by putting this particular audit on the front burner, so to speak, and not letting it drag out for the months and months that it's dragged out throughout the primaries and through the major political and through the presidential campaign itself in the fall, and even during the transition since then. So it seems to me that there's a little bit of responsibility here on the IRS as well. And I don't know what is involved in the audit. I don't know what would be involved in expediting or speeding up the audit. But it seems to me that it's become an issue of national importance. And as such, it would seem to me that the IRS has a responsibility to the public to do everything it can to provide for the release of this tax information, or at least, if not, to take away the excuse of the audit, so that it would be clear to everybody that the only reason that the president-elect is refusing to make his tax returns public is because he doesn't want to. I think maybe that's, as I think about it in my own mind, I think that's what I'm hearing. That's what I believe. I believe that the audit is a convenient excuse and that IRS would be doing us a favor, a service, if they took away that particular excuse. So I'm raising that particular question. One of the issues that I'd like to address early on in today's program is a new book that has come out on the extent to which racism played a more significant role in the early history of this nation than many of us expected. I try to be, and I've not been as dutiful in this as I would like to be, but I try to stay up with a publication that many I know of you are familiar with, the New York Review of Books. It's one of the finest publications that I've seen, and I've been a subscriber to it three or four different times during the years. Although I have to acknowledge that it's a very, very expensive publication. It costs close to $100 a year to be a regular subscriber to the New York Review. If you go online to NY Review of Books, you'll find that they always make 15-20% of their reviews available online. Usually what you find is that 3 out of every 4 of the articles in the latest publication or edition are not available unless you're a subscriber. And so depending on finances, sometimes I've chosen to let my subscription lapse. I go online because I recognize how valuable this particular publication is. And more often than not, I find myself, even with the few reviews that I do have access to, I find them very worthwhile. And that's what happened over this past weekend. I checked the latest articles, the latest reviews in the New York Review of Books. And let me just tell you briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with the New York Review, there are book reviews and there are book reviews. And what I have recognized and learned over the years was that to have your book reviewed in the New York Review is significant. And the reason for that is the reviews tend to be extensive and well done. They are written by other people in the field who have particular expertise in the same subject or the same issues that the book is about. They have something to say, and they can react substantively to what the book says. So therefore, when in the New York Review, when the reviewer pays compliments to a particular book that is being reviewed, you can take that to the bank, because the review is substantive, it's expensive, it gets into the content and the substance of the book in question. The reviews tend to be rather lengthy. I've printed out several of them that will print out to be 5, 6, 7 pages, if you will. There are other reviews where people will review, but they really don't say a whole lot about the book. They tend to be very superficial. But the New York reviews tend to be something much more than that. They tend to be lengthy, they tend to be substantive, and they tend to be worth reading. And one of the things that I have made references over the years and recommendations to students over the years to take advantage of the fact that if you're on a campus, you can go to the library, and every reputable library in the country is a subscriber to the New York Review of Books. And you can go into the library on a regular basis. It comes out 3 times a month. So what that means is that you can go into your campus library almost every other week, if you will, and spend several hours just going through the reviews. Obviously, some of the books are books that you might not be interested in, but chances are there are going to be 4 or 5 that really do connect with your particular interests. Such is one of the reviews that I was privileged to read this weekend. The book in question is a new book published by University of North Carolina Press by a historian named Robert Parkinson. And the title of the book is The Common Cause: Creating Race and Nation in the American Revolution. It's a review that obviously attracted my attention because of the subject. When I saw that this review was about the American Revolution, I realized that this is a review I wanted to spend some time on. Not only that, but I just happen to know about, I'm familiar with the person who's reviewing the book for the New York Review. Her name is Annette Gordon Reed. She's a historian at Harvard. She's a member of the law school at Harvard, and she holds a chair at Harvard of American legal history. She's one of the nation's most reputable and accomplished scholars. And she praises this book. And one of the things she addresses, and this is one of the issues that caught my attention, the book is almost 750 pages in length. That alone suggested to me that the book is probably filled with a lot of documentation and information that might be classified as information overload. In other words, a 750-page book on the American Revolution in today's world seems almost to suggest that you would have to be publishing things that other people have already published. A lot of what's in here was likely to be redundant. And that, in fact, chances are the book could have been done in a lot fewer pages, in much less length than it was completed in. The reviewer, Annette Gordon Reed, addresses this issue and points out that what makes this particular book important is that it includes information that most historians have not chosen to focus on in the past. This is new stuff. Her sense is that from now on, when people talk about the American Revolution, this book is going to be on the short list of those books that anybody interested in the American Revolution must make it a point to read, because it contains information that's not written or not included in other books on the same subject. The issue is race. Obviously, at the time of the Revolution, there is an indication or a temptation to think or to believe that this book is about slavery at the time of the American Revolution. In a way it is, but not really. What makes this book significant and worth a read is that it addresses slavery primarily because of the impact that the existence of slavery had on the subject. And the subject of the book is the idea of the common cause. How did the founders build a movement to win the support of the general public necessary to pull off the American Revolution? What were the ingredients of what the author, Mr. Parkinson, Robert Parkinson, calls the common cause? What were the commonalities, the things that people could tie into, that made it possible for the founders, the leaders of the independence movement, to successfully build a movement that produced independence? And Mr. Parkinson's answer to that question is race. That race not only is included as one of the considerations in the movement for independence, but that in fact race becomes a major issue, a major vehicle for building a movement that makes independence successful. The reviewer points out that it's generally been a matter of assumption. It's generally been believed that what makes America different from other countries is that becoming or being an American is not a matter of blood, of DNA, of cultural connections that are created over time. Being an American necessitates being committed to a set of ideals laid down by the founders. Ideals which probably are best attributed to Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. The ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the extent to which these ideals have become in the minds of many Americans America's creed. This is what America is all about. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The problem is that most Americans have known and realize that there are some issues here which create conflict. Because the fact of the matter is, we know that many of the people that were most instrumental in building the movement for independence did not subscribe to the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. Many of these founders owned slaves, Jefferson among them. Many of those who didn't own slaves supported the idea of slavery. And the fact of the matter is, many of these people who signed on to the ideals of America's creed were very comfortable treating not only African Americans, but Native Americans as second-class citizens, as people not to be included in the nation or in the creation of a people which we have come to call Americans. We've known that there are many people in our society, Native Americans, blacks, who have had a difficult time throughout our history relating to the founding, because it was, in their minds, very difficult for them to look at the founding as applying to them at all. They didn't seem to fit. The founding and the ideals on which it was based didn't seem to apply to them. In today's world, we've seen the issue of race renewed on the front pages of our newspapers. In race relations in many of our cities, involving extreme force on the part of police officers. We've seen the emergence of a movement entitled Black Lives Matter. We've seen evidence that the issue of race has not gone away in this country, and that at times, while it seems to be off the front pages, it almost seems inevitable that eventually something's going to happen which brings race back to the front pages. The fact of the matter is, for some time, historians of the American Revolution have been focusing on the slave issue. In fact, one historian, David Waldstreicher, refers to the Constitution of the United States as slavery's constitution because it enshrined slavery within the context of the supreme law of the land. It condoned slavery. It did more than condone slavery. It basically used compromises on the principles of slavery, on the elements of slavery, in order to get the Constitution ratified. The Slave Trade Amendment, the Three-Fifths Compromise. Every time it appeared that the Constitutional Convention might break up, the issue revolved directly or indirectly around the institution of slavery, around the question of race. Let me share with you what the reviewer, Annette Gordon-Reed, says about Parkinson's book, The Common Cause, Creating Race and Nation in the American Revolution. She refers to it as a brilliant, timely, indispensable book that offers a provocative alternative to the conventional views that blacks' perpetual alien status in the United States is simply a natural outgrowth of having been slaves. There has been an assumption or a tendency in previous studies on the American Revolution which have raised the issue of slavery at all. There has been the assumption that the mere existence of slavery in this country is really the reason why blacks in this country have ever since felt a sense of alienation toward the nation. According to this particular review, Dr. Gordon Reed says, Americans were deciding who was in and who was out as soon as they began to fight Great Britain. And then she says, Parkinson does not discount slavery's importance in shaping attitudes about African Americans. He doesn't deny that the early American Republic saw open calls for something termed a white man's government. But, she says, Parkinson's goes back to 1775, even before the Declaration of Independence, when the American Revolution turned into the Revolutionary War, to locate the origins of racial exclusion in society that would become the United States of America. It was then, during these days, Parkinson says, that patriot leaders made a fateful choice. They embarked on a very specific, concerted plan to place blacks and Native Americans, no matter what their condition, whether they believed in the Patriots' cause or not, firmly outside the boundaries of America's experiment with democratic republicanism. Parkinson's thesis is the leaders of the movement for independence made a decision as early as 1775 that this would be a white man's republic, and that Native Americans and African Americans would not be included as equals in it, irrespective of what the Declaration of Independence said, irrespective of what's in the Constitution that seems to raise questions about slavery, even though the Constitution does indeed legitimize slavery. Parkinson writes the following in his book. Men like Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and Washington developed a myth about who was and who was not part of the revolutionary movement, about who had an interest and who didn't. According to Parkinson, these men chose to prosecute the American War for independence in a way that made race at the very heart of the issue. They actually helped foment racial prejudice as the principal means of creating unity across the 13 colonies in order to prepare Americans to do battle with Great Britain. The base sentiments they promoted for political expediency survived the fighting, and the narrative that dismissed blacks and Native Americans as alien to America and conflated white and citizen lived at the heart of the republic it helped create for decades to come. It kept both groups from being included as Americans. This is pretty blunt. It suggests that from the very beginning, there is hard evidence to demonstrate that the founders throughout the colonies, not just in the southern colonies, throughout the colonies, made the decision that this republic would not include African Americans or Native Americans as equal members in the society, despite what the Declaration of Independence says. And here's a quote from Parkinson's book. This refusal to extend to African Americans and Indians the benefits of emerging concepts of liberal subjectivity in the form of citizenship had ghastly consequences, for it legitimated and excused the destruction of vast numbers of human beings. Unquote. Consequently, the reviewer says, this is why the book is so long. In order to include evidence for allegations and a thesis this blunt required the publication and inclusion of information that historians had tended not to include in their studies before. This is new stuff. It's been overlooked for the most part. But as a result of this book, the reviewer says, it's not going to be overlooked anymore. Parkinson, in the book, reminds us, quote, jealousies, rivalries, and even violent controversies alienated the colonies in the early 70s. Border conflicts, religious disputes, and concerns about slavery drove them apart. The colonies were just as poised to attack one another as to join together against the mother country. The near impossibility of getting the colonies to agree to oppose Great Britain with one voice meant compromises on the most divisive issues on the one hand and creative storytelling on the other. It was going to be necessary to build a narrative based on excluding African Americans and Native Americans from citizenship. According to the reviewer, the idea of building common cause, creating a movement, signaled that something important was at stake, something that created an inside us versus an outside them. Delineating a common cause, protecting the colonies against alleged overreaching by the British government as it made various imperial reforms, was a necessary first step in the process of binding the colonies to one another. A crucial question, then, is how to figure out who was the us and who was going to be designated the them. John Adams, this is a very famous quote. John Adams said the following about the idea of revolution and the war for independence. The complete accomplishment of uniting the colonies in so short a time and by such simple means was perhaps a singular example in the history of mankind. 13 clocks were made to strike together, a perfection of mechanism which no artist has ever before affected, unquote. That's John Adams. The famous stories about 13 clocks striking at the same time. Parkinson's point is, there may be 13 clocks, but in order to get them to strike at the same time, leaders had to do something. Leaders had to do whatever they needed to do in order to set the clocks so that they chimed at the same time. Later in life, in his back and forth letter relationship with Thomas Jefferson, Adams drew a distinction between the American Revolution and the war. that he said was no part of the revolution. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was affected from 1760 to 1775. The revolution happened within the minds of the American people as they began to see themselves less and less as members of the British Empire and more as Americans. That was the American Revolution, John Adams said. A sea change in the attitudes of many colonists toward Britain and toward the empire had to take place, John Adams says. The American Revolution, however, was far from complete in 1775. After Lexington and Concord, Parkinson tells us, the Patriots needed a new script to animate a new kind of resistance. They needed war stories. War stories that the Patriots told made Republican policies of exclusion possible by supplying patriotic ammunition for attacking Indians and expanding west, and gave rhetorical cover to those who sought to deepen and extend the slave system. This common cause narrative buried race deep in the political structure of the new republic, unquote. This is the key to the whole book, I believe. This is why I think this review is so important. I believe that it is particularly important on this particular day, the day we celebrate the birthday of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is an American icon because he was fighting a racism which this historian tells us was built into this system from the very beginning. It just didn't happen. We are not a nation that periodically experiences racial issues because slavery existed. What Parkinson is saying is the reason we are a nation with racial issues is because from the very beginning, we built the very nature of the and structure of the nation on questions related to race. We made conscious decisions to win the war by playing the race card. Consequently, the narrative which made the war for independence possible buried race deep within the political structure of this new republic. These war stories were, Parkinson tells us, required because the British were doing everything that they could do to use race against the colonists. The British were offering freedom to slaves who would take up arms against their masters. And in order to counter that, the colonists had to do something. They had to find ways to separate in people's minds the fact that they were members or subjects of the British Empire, or that they were connected racially or culturally to the British Empire or to the mother country. This was part of the war stories. Basically, what Parkinson tells us is eloquent words about abstract rights. The Declaration of Independence couldn't do it. History, Parkinson said, has taught the sad lesson that fear and contempt are most predictably the powerful motivators for galvanizing one group to move against another. Leaders of the independence movement, quote, had to destroy as much of the public's affection for their ancestors as they could, unquote. Basically, in order to build the movement for independence, it was necessary to sever the cultural and psychological link that colonists had with the British, with the mother country. And the way they did that was to use race against the British. And this, I didn't know about this. This is something that I did not know about. Benjamin Franklin worked closely with Lafayette in order to make up the kinds of stories about the groups being used by the British as proxies. They prepared a book which they never published, with illustrations for children and for posterity, that detailed British abuses of Americans. Of the 26 proposed illustrations, Franklin's suggested 20 of them. Lafayette did the other 6. Many revolve around the proxies. Lafayette, for example, suggested an illustration showing prisoners being roasted for a great festival where the Canadian Indians are eating American flesh, unquote. He also proposed a scene depicting British officers taking the opportunity of corrupting Negroes and engaging them to desert from their house, to rob, even to murder their masters. Britain's military mercenaries, the Hessians, those we know who were paid mercenaries, were not so depicted. Only blacks and Native Americans were depicted as animals, as inhuman, that the British were using against the American patriots, the American colonies. The reviewer makes the following statement: Americans today often speak of racial prejudice as a thing that simply exists like air, with no nod to the actual work it takes to create mainstream systems based on prejudice. Parkinson zeroes in on that work. What it took in the 1770s, he says, in order to stoke racial hostility and keep it going. They planted stories, supplied letters, and other documents in order to make their case. They went to the newspapers, the most advanced method of communication in the 18th century. They planted stories and supplied letters to make the case. And this is important. This material was not placed on the front pages of the newspapers. Those front pages were directed at, quote, elite colonists, unquote. They contained political and cultural writings, poems, and positions on freedom and on government and on the British, on the Enlightenment ideas of David Hume and the others. Those were on the front page of the papers. That's what most historians have looked at. When I did my research for ratification of the Constitution, that's where I looked. On the front pages of newspapers. Because if you found an article that was relevant, that you believed was relevant, and you started to take down quotes and make notes on that article, oftentimes that particular piece was continued, but not inside the paper. It would be on the front page of the next edition of the paper. So sometimes you'd have to look at 3 or 4 consecutive editions of a newspaper in order to get the complete article. The back pages of the newspaper, Parkinson says, usually contained advertisements. These narratives, these stories about Native Americans and African Americans were built into, quote, the interior of the newspapers, where the bulk of the actual news appeared. A place, Parkinson says, that has received insufficient attention from historians of the Revolution. He's right. Most of this stuff was fill. And in my research, and I was doing it on microfilm, it's very difficult to read. The print was difficult. Much of it was faded. It was hard to read. And so much of the stuff that was in the middle pages of the paper was considered to be local stuff that you didn't understand anyway. So there was an inclination to not pay that much attention to it. While historians have focused, Parkinson says, on George Washington's going to Cambridge to head the Continental Army in 1775, Parkinson says the real story of 1775 were the hundreds of smaller messages that were included in colonial newspapers about the threat that blacks and Indians, allegedly under total control of the British, posed to American lives. These messages continued throughout the war. Patriot leaders, Parkinson said, worked assiduously to make this the foundation of why colonists should support resistance to the British and eventually support independence. They did it even though blacks and Native Americans, in many cases, fought with the Patriots. Crispus Attucks, you remember, first African American to die in the War for American Independence at Bunker Hill. We know that there were African Americans and Native Americans that supported the movement for independence. They didn't get into the papers. Unless Americans, Parkinson said, unless Americans watched the army march by, they had scarcely any idea that there were hundreds of African Americans and Indian soldiers serving under Washington's command. Even though the Continental Army would be the most integrated army in the United States would field until the Vietnam War, most Americans had little knowledge of their service in fighting for the common cause. Many of the stories that were in these newspapers were fake. Members of these groups, African Americans and Indians, in the minds of people were bad. Americans didn't distinguish between good and bad amongst these people. They were not good because they could never be white, Parkinson says. In fact, you find that there's a change in tone toward the Hessian soldiers after the Battle of Trenton. After Washington defeats them at Trenton, eventually there's a change in attitude to where the Hessians are looked upon as sympathetic victims of the British rather than participants in this war. Of course, we know in the Declaration of Independence, the bulk of the Declaration focuses on Jefferson's long train of abuses in the last half of the Declaration. In it, he talks about the British, the king, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death. Talks about domestic insurrections being instigated amongst us, and the British endeavoring to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. Parkinson says the Declaration of Independence was an effort to draw a line between friends and enemies, between us and them, or in this particular case, between we, the Americans, and he, the king. This Declaration of Independence is the first assertion of an American people, and it doesn't include African Americans or Native Americans. Parkinson says that the most important two words in the Declaration of Independence are not about equality and happiness. The most important words are he and we, speaking of King George and the American people, the opposing forces to which the common cause addressed itself. There's absolutely no question that this particular book is a critical contribution to the bibliographical study of the causes of American independence. It goes a long way toward explaining the basis of racism and the reason why this nation is continually confronted over and over again with the very difficult issues of race. When Native Americans and African Americans believe and claim that they don't feel that they're really equal partners in this nation, in this culture, in this political fabric, the fact of the matter is, according to Parkinson's study, they never were intended to be. That what we're about now, creating an inclusive society, what Lincoln talked about at the time of the Civil War, about looking upon the Declaration of Independence as indeed America's creed, and becoming the first nation in the history of the world to make it happen, to actually live the ideals and the philosophy of the American Revolution, was, Lincoln believed, the most noble goal that Americans could pursue. It's Lincoln that's responsible for our efforts since then to create an inclusive society. But the fact of the matter is, up until that time, there was never a plan. Basically, what Parkinson has told us is in order to successfully build a movement to make the War of Independence successful, you had to find a way to psychologically separate American colonists from their British ancestors. And the way to do it is to assign collaboration of Native Americans and African Americans to the British and point out that they were the ones who were willing to do this, and therefore our movement for independence was legitimate and justified. I think this is an incredible, incredible study. It says an awful lot. I think what it says needs to be taken very seriously. I think the author, the historian who reviewed this book, Gordon Reed, and that's Gordon Reed, is right. I think this is something that all of us need to consider and take very seriously. We've gone beyond the top of the hour. I realize that. It's 10 minutes after the hour, 10 minutes after 2 in the East. We are going to pause and take a short break, 4 or 5 minutes. And then when we come back, I want to share with you yet another book. This is one that I think is worth all of us taking the time to familiarize ourselves with. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back, and we'll still have 45 minutes of our second hour left. I invite you to stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to the second portion of our program today here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Martin Luther King Day. It is Monday, the 15th day of January in the year 2017. If you're just joining us, welcome. and I hope that you are enjoying this holiday. Many people obviously are off of work today and out of school because it is indeed a holiday. That's what I believe the book that we just considered, um, Parkinson's book on Common Cause and the role that race played in the building of a revolutionary movement, a movement for independence in this country, is very, very important. I think it's not only appropriate because of today, because of what we're celebrating today, but I believe the book is very important because it suggests other things. It suggests that the role that race has played throughout our history is not something that just happened, but it's something that from the very beginning was built into the political fabric itself. It's something that we were going to have to deal with from the very beginning. And we tried to do that. Maybe not as successfully as we could have or as we should have. But the fact of the matter is we're dealing with a legacy that others put there in a different age at a different time for what they thought was a legitimate reason. And all of us have had to deal with the fallout. I think that this is an incredibly important book. And I think this particular review in the New York Review of Books by Annette Gordon Reed is well worth reading. I think it suggests that there's information in this particular book that Parkinson has excluded, has taken from colonial newspapers throughout the country, which really warrants a serious look. And I trust that a number of us will indeed do that. We do invite your reaction, your response to some of these issues. We have a phone number, as we've told you many times. We do invite you to come on the air and share your thoughts or your ideas, concerns, questions, whatever, with us, with our audience, and hopefully we'll be able to initiate some responses and some reaction to your reaction. I think all of us would be better off should those kinds of things happen as often as we can make them happen. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate one-on-one with me via email, I invite you to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And again, I do call your attention to our Facebook page. As a result of the material that we looked at in our first hour today, I really do believe that it would be well worth my while to spend some time later today, this evening, posting something on Facebook related to this particular view, this particular book, and the subject of it. I think it's relevant. I think it's important. I think it's something that all of us need to consider very seriously. It's a story about America's story that we've not heard before. We've not heard it because historians have not found it for us. And the fact of the matter is, many of us don't want to hear it anyway. That's why I think it's an important story. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program today, there is another book that I want to call your attention. This one is not a history of the founding. It is a book on contemporary society today. It is the sixth and latest book of Thomas Friedman, op-ed writer for the New York Times. As we know, Thomas Friedman has been one of the world's most noted writers and experts on the Middle East for a number of years. He has been awarded Pulitzer Prizes on 3 different occasions for columns and articles and research that he's done. This particular book, which, to be honest with you, I really hadn't known about or hadn't recognized as being out there until this past weekend is a book that Friedman calls "Thank You for Being Late," and then it's subtitled "An Optimist's Guide to Efforts to Deal with Society's Accelerations." Excuse me. And basically, the subject of this is, of course, the accelerations, and what Friedman means by that is the speed of change. The degree to which change is so changing our way of life that it's affecting all of us, all the people in it. Let me share with you what I can about this particular book. And let me do it by suggesting that this weekend I inadvertently turned on, just to see what was there, I turned on C-SPAN. And as you know, there are 2 C-SPAN channels, and one of them on weekends deals with books. It usually attends book reviews and presentations being given at book fairs and book festivals around the nation. The particular review I happened to tune in on over the weekend was Thomas Friedman's address on his latest book, "Thank You for Being Late." It was an address that he delivered at a synagogue in Washington, D.C. It is a synagogue that he regularly attends. He makes the point at the beginning of his presentation. It is the very same synagogue where his daughter and son-in-law were married some years ago in 2005. This particular presentation, which runs for about 45 or 50 minutes, is available on YouTube. If you go to Google and you type in Thomas Friedman, "Thank You for Being Late," you will gain access to 4 or 5 different addresses that Friedman has given around the country to different audiences on his latest book. The one that I recommend that you look at, this is the one that I happen to see, is the one delivered at the Washington, D.C. synagogue. It was delivered on the 28th of November of this past year. So it's about 2 months old now. Let me tell you about this particular book and why I think it's important. Friedman's presentation begins, first of all, by addressing his title, why he called it "Thank You for Being Late." And he basically goes back and tells the story about the numbers of people that have been late for breakfast meetings and all of that in the years that he's been in journalism, that he's been speaking to groups and all the rest of it. And he said that one particular point, it became so common for people to be late that at one point, when somebody came and apologized for being late, the typical excuses, the traffic was too heavy, the roads were, congested, or there was a stoppage in traffic or something else. Friedman said he made the comment at one point on one particular occasion and said, "Oh no, on the contrary, thank you for being late." And basically what he said was that because you were late, I was able to concentrate on what was going on around me. I was able to people watch while I was waiting for you, and I learned so much. And so basically Friedman's argument is, thank you for the opportunity to learn. And then he makes a statement that I thought gives an indication and a flavor for the whole book. And it's pretty perceptive comment, and I thought it's very telling. And Friedman says, when it comes to computers, when you hit the pause button, the computer stops, the thing stops. But Friedman says when it comes to human beings, when you hit the pause button, that's when things start. It's when we stop, when we take the time to reflect, when we take the time to observe and really look at the world around us, we begin to see and appreciate things which sometimes the fast pace of our life makes impossible for us to appreciate. I thought that analogy about the pause button was very, very important. Basically, what Friedman's book is about is the difficulty that Americans face, that the whole world faces, in trying to adjust and deal not just with change, but with the rapid pace of change. Change is happening so rapidly, so quickly. And he goes through and provides in this presentation some of the most insightful, relevant material that I've heard. This particular review of this book, for me, was so infectious that I'm ordering the book. This is one I want on my shelf because it's so relevant to so many of us about today's world. And basically, it's talking not so much about the change itself as much as it is about the pace of change and how difficult it is for all of us to keep up. And the fact of the matter is, what he's saying is, it's important that we try, because this, in many ways, while it's one of the most frightening periods in man's history, it's also one of the most exciting and potentially one of the most positive. And that's what I think makes this book one that I really want to read. So let me recommend, if you do have the time, if you have 45 minutes or so, to Google on to Thomas Friedman, Thank You for Being Late, and you'll see 4 or 5 options there for YouTube under presentations he's made about this particular book. I haven't seen them all, but the one I did see, the one that happened at the synagogue in Washington, D.C., sold me on the book. And I invite you to look at it for yourselves. That's the issue that I'd like to share some of this with you, because I think if I can basically make it so that you're curious enough to look at this video, chances are you'll probably find this book to be one. And again, I do so fully aware of the fact that a lot of people have real serious issues with Tom Friedman. Many people think he's a hypocrite, he's sold out, he's a millionaire, blah, 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 all of these things. But the fact of the matter is he's renowned and he's noted and he's recognized for what he is and what he can do and what he knows and how insightful he is. The fact of the matter is he writes and speaks in ways which all of us can understand. He's not talking over our heads, he's talking directly to us. And I think he's got an awful lot to say. One of the most fascinating parts of the presentation, one of the most fascinating chapters in the book, I suspect, is one of the early chapters he does on the year 2007. And basically, Friedman goes through in his presentation in this video and talks about the numbers of things that happened in 2007. The iPhone emerged. Kindle emerged. Many other software packages emerged. 2007 was the year that Watson, the computer, defeated 2 champions on Jeopardy. 2007 was the year that many of us became convinced that we had now reached the point where we were making machines that could outthink human beings. And he goes on and talks about other things. The emergence of what we call today the cloud, 2007. Facebook, 2007. Twitter, 2007. And then he points out something that really catches your attention. And Friedman said, all of these things happened in 2007, and we missed all of it. We missed all of it as it was happening. And of course, what he says on his feet, and you can take this for what it's worth, he said, the reason we missed it, 2008. And what we had in 2008, of course, was the election of Barack Obama. We also had the beginning of the fallout of the Great Recession. That's the period when people were losing their jobs, their homes. One of the things that Friedman talks about here is the extent to which the world of work has changed. And so many of his chapters address specific issues and topics that have been affected by the change and the rate of change that he addresses in this book. One of his chapters addresses the workplace. Another addresses the family. Another addresses the community. His last chapter is on community. And Friedman makes the point that he really believes, he's really comfortable in addressing the importance of community because he grew up in one. And he talks about the, relatively speaking, a Jewish ghetto when he grew up in the suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Specifically, he's talking about a place called St. Louis Park. And it becomes a predominantly Jewish community in a period of about 3 years in the early 21st century. Or in the late 20th century. And he names many of the prominent people, Jewish folks, that grew up in that community at approximately the same time. And he talks about the degree of community that they were able to create there and how beneficial growing up in that kind of a community was. And how that community, that kind of community really, in his mind, is the model that all of us need to find a way to create. The only difference is that at that time, a community that was made up predominantly of Caucasian American Protestants was forced to accept the influx of Jews from Minnesota, from Minneapolis, all of them congregating into that one community. Now, he said, 40 years later, he's gone back to St. Louis Park, and he finds that the makeup is pretty much the same, except that now 25% of the community is made up of Somalis. And the community is wrestling with the need to find a way to include a significant portion of Somali Americans in their community. Basically, his argument is this particular community and the challenges it faces is much the same as the threat and the challenge that the nation faces today. And he talks about that. But in terms of the workplace, let me give you just a couple of examples of some of the things that Friedman addresses in this particular case. He talks about education. He's talking about changes in education which are happening rapidly. He's talking about the fact that our educational institutions can't possibly keep up with the pace of change that's happening. But technology is, cyberspace is. He talks about AT&T. He points out that at AT&T, the corporation is rewriting the social compact, the social contract. Many people talk about what it will take to become a lifelong employee at AT&T. And he said AT&T is laying out the terms of that deal. And that is, if you want to be a lifetime employee at AT&T, you must commit to being a lifelong learner. AT&T will come and test strengths, attributes, that people must have in order to be successful in the contemporary world of work, in the contemporary workplace. AT&T is willing to pay for people to take the appropriate classes in order to build strength where they currently don't have them in some of those attributes. But the requirement is that you must take these classes on your own time. But AT&T commits. If you take them and you successfully pass them, then AT&T will commit to you for lifelong employment. In other words, in order to remain an employee at AT&T, you've got to be willing to continually upgrade your skills and your talents in order to keep up with a world which promises to change, perhaps even more rapidly and more tremendously than it already has. He talks about the Khan Academy. He talks about the appropriate nature of the Khan Academy in targeting specific courses towards specific subjects. All of it free, all of it not costing anything, all of it there for people to take advantage of if they're willing to do it, if they're willing to put in the time. And basically, that's what Friedman is talking about, is the need for the commitment of time in order to be successful in the changing world of work. He talks about other areas as well. He talks about much of the change in technology that I really can't comment on because all of it's news to me. I don't know. I don't understand the nature of the cloud. But the way he explains it, it basically amounts to making 1 million different computers function as if they were one. It's tied in with revolution in networking, in communication, in the rapid communication and transmission of information and expertise around the world. And he points out that our political system, our republic, our schools, our institutions haven't really kept up with the pace of change. And much of that change is attributable to us. It happened here. But unfortunately, most of us missed it. And Friedman's position in this book is to lay out the strategies as to the kinds of things that are happening, the speed at which they are happening, and what we can and must do in order to address these kinds of challenges. I think it basically suggests to be one of the most important, significant books in a long time. One of the reviews of the book that I read made the point that of the 6 books he's written already, and many of them have been Damascus to Jerusalem and The World is Flat and many of these other books, many of them have been ambitious. But one of the reviewers makes the point and said this might be the most ambitious book that Thomas Friedman has written yet, because it takes on the totality of the world in which all of us are struggling to figure out how to make it, how to adjust, and how to basically get a degree of control over forces that are so directly affecting our lives, all of us. But at the end of his presentation, he talks about his last chapter on community. Talks about growing up in St. Louis Park. Talks about the specific nature and importance of community and the degree to which we need to find a way to build it, to recover it, to rediscover it. Very honestly, as I say this, I'm thinking back to our first hour. I'm thinking of Parkinson's book on Common Cause at the time of the American Revolution and the conscious decision to use race and build it into the fabric of building a revolutionary movement to secure independence from Great Britain. I guess what I'm thinking of is the blatant contradiction between the first hour and this one. Here we are talking about what's necessary to build community, an inclusive community, And what we talked about in the first hour is our effort to use race to deny certain groups of people the right to be included, to create a political or a cultural fabric in America which was made up of us's and them's, of we's and him's, to differentiate between those to be included and those who will not be included. Fact of the matter is, the community that Friedman is talking about needs to be a community of inclusion. We need to find a way to overcome a past which has consciously practiced exclusion and tried to cover it up under the guise of community when in fact it is really not. At the end of Friedman's presentation, he talks about a presentation on this particular book that he was making in San Francisco. And he said during the question and answer period, after he made the presentation, somebody shouted out a question from the audience. And the question was, is God in cyberspace? Friedman says he was totally thrown by that question. Nobody had ever asked it before. He had never thought about it before. And he admitted that to his audience. And he said after the presentation was over, he communicated with his rabbi. And he communicated with a close friend in the Middle East, a rabbi that he's known for some time. And he basically shared with this friend and confidant the question, is God in cyberspace? And the response he gets is very interesting. Basically, what Friedman is told is that the Jewish tradition encompasses two different, separate views of God. The first one is biblical. The second one is post-biblical. Friedman said that his friend made the statement and said, the biblical approach to God in Jewish tradition is based on the principle that God rewards good and punishes evil. And if you take that approach, then it's hard to argue that God is in cyberspace. Because what we see in cyberspace is pornography and crime and cheating and fraud and vindictive and personal attacks and innuendo and all the rest of it. It's very clear that if there was a God in cyberspace, we wouldn't be experiencing in cyberspace the negative things we are experiencing. But then his friend says, there's also the biblical approach to God, the post-biblical approach to God. And the post-biblical approach is that if you want God in cyberspace, you need to bring him there. You need to be the one who builds values, ideals, and principles to cyberspace. Because the one thing Friedman says about cyberspace that we know is that all of this change, all these things are happening rapidly, but nobody's in charge. And what that means is people need to be in charge. If we want there to be God in cyberspace, we need to bring him there. And what that means is the golden rule. Treat others as you would have them treated. To bring values to cyberspace. And basically, this is what he ends his book with, is the responsibility we all have for the world we're in. Instead of looking at a distant alien God to impose himself in our lives, to rescue us from some of the negatives in the world we find ourselves in. What Friedman is pointing out instead is that we really need to embrace the Jewish tradition, both post-biblical tradition, which is, if we want God in cyberspace, we need to bring him there. Values in cyberspace are going to depend on us, on how we treat each other, on how we view each other. And that means the need not only for family, but the need for strong, vibrant, viable communities where people can work together to solve problems. Friedman says that in today's world, we are living at a crossroads like none that mankind has ever confronted before. At the end of 1945, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what we realized is that we were dealing with a world where one nation could destroy all life on the planet. Friedman says now it appears that what we're dealing with is a world in which one person could destroy all life on the planet. But the fact of the matter is, with what's happening, with the changes that are occurring, and the potential good that is available to us from those changes, we now stand at a crossroads. Because not only have we never before lived in a world where one person could destroy all life on the planet, but on the other side of that, we now live in a world where we all working together have the capability to fix everything that's negative on the planet. We have the potential to eliminate poverty, to raise the quality of living, the standard of living, the level of education, the way people treat each other, of everybody on the face of the earth like man has never had before. We have more power in our hands today, Friedman says, than man has ever had any time in history in the past. The reason we're at a crossroads is because it's not yet clear which way we're going to go. Friedman's argument is we've got to make a decision, and we've got to do it fast, and it needs to be the right one. I really do recommend that you take 45 minutes of your time with a cup of coffee or a beer or whatever you're comfortable with. Sit down in front of the computer, click on Google, type in Tom Friedman, thank you for being late. Check out the YouTube options there and pick one of them. Even if and each one tells you how long it is, how long the presentation is. The one that I'm referring to is, I believe, I think it says 41 minutes or something. It was one of the most creative, insightful, interesting, well-delivered presentations that I've ever seen. I recommend it. I recommend the book. I plan to get the book. I think it addresses questions. Last evening, I asked my wife and her granddaughter to come in and watch the Friedman presentation. My granddaughter right now is a senior in high school. She's planning on applying for colleges. She's talking about taking the college boards. She's talking about prep opportunities, preparing opportunities to prepare her for the college boards so that she can do better. She was unfamiliar with the Khan Academy. And so after this was over, she was asking me about the Khan Academy. She was very interested in the idea of lifelong learning and what it meant. I think it's a very valuable presentation. It's one that all of us should take advantage of. And even if you don't get the book, at least to know it's out there, and at least to be able to appreciate what's in it and what role it might play in addressing some of the problems that confront all of us. I think it is very valuable. We're at 50 minutes of the hour. We've got less than 10 minutes left in our program, so I have another issue, but I really don't think that we're probably going to get very far in it today. But let me point out what I did at the very beginning. It deals with the issue of freedom of the press. More specifically, it deals with access to the kind of information that we depend upon the press to provide. The spur for this, what really makes this issue an issue, was Donald Trump's press conference last Wednesday in which he attacked CNN and the media. He's done that periodically throughout the campaign. But this particular attack was poignant because he denied a CNN reporter the opportunity to ask a question at the press conference because he accused CNN of what he called fake news. The issue that I addressed last Wednesday, and the issue that I want to pursue again here at the Virtual Center, is the issue of the role of the press in a popular government. The idea of the press, of the media, as what one commentator called the fourth branch of government. Legislative, executive, judicial, and the media. Because the media is responsible for gaining access and delivering information to the people that they need in order to be able to participate intelligently in this republic. That was James Madison's point in the letter he wrote to W.T. Barry in 1822. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. James Madison. What Donald Trump is suggesting in his attacks on the media is the fact that he intends to make it very difficult for the media to dig out from his administration the kinds of information that the general public needs in order to adequately participate in this republic. What that means is to adequately participate in this republic means to become an informed citizen. It's very clear that what the potential of what Donald Trump has proposed here in his attack on the media is his challenge to the legitimacy of the media. He's challenged the legitimacy of our intelligence agencies. He's challenged the validity and the necessity and importance of the information they provide to the president. He's challenging the information that the media presents. By calling it fake news, he's basically suggesting that you can't believe anything that the media tells us. If that's true, then the republic as we know it can't work. Citizens can't be participants because they cannot gain access to the information they need to be informed, even if they want to be. And one of the issues that we dealt with last time was the issue that there's a significant portion of the electorate that became visible in this recent election, which suggests that they don't want to know. That suggests that even if the information is out there, they would prefer not knowing about it. Or that they intend to move forward with what they already believe, irrespective of any information or any additional news related to that matter. In other words, legitimizing the validity of ignorance and basically suggesting that being informed versus remaining ignorant is a legitimate choice. It may be a legitimate choice of a human being in the abstract, but it is not the legitimate choice of an informed citizen in a republic like this one. I want to draw your attention to an article which was written in 1967. 1967, I'm sorry. 1967. It was an article written by Hannah Arendt. A-R-E-N-D-T. Hannah Arendt. She'd written a number of books and scholarly pieces while she was alive. She died some years ago. One of the books she wrote was a book on revolutions, in which she compared different historical revolutions throughout history. I read that book a number of years ago. But in 1967, she published an article in the New Yorker, which, let me tell you, is very long, and it's very, very difficult reading. But I think you'll agree that the title of the article suggests its importance. The title of Hannah Arendt's article is Truth and Politics. It appeared in the New Yorker on February 25th, 1967. Basically, what Hannah Arendt does is address what she says is commonplace, is obvious. And that is, and I'm quoting her directly here, no one has ever doubted that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other. And no one, as far as I know, has ever counted truthfulness among the political virtues. What she is addressing here is the very basic, inherent antagonism that exists between politics and news, between politics and truth. And in the course of this essay, which, as I mentioned, is very long, in the New Yorker, it extends for something, I think it's like 11 pages or something. It's extremely long. I spent the weekend wrestling with this article. I've read it a couple of times. In this particular article, and the reason I wanted to deal with it, she approaches the different kinds, the different definitions of truth, the extent to which truth is revealed by a creator, by a God, the degree to which many people believe that the only way to know truth is to have it revealed to you. And then, during the so-called Enlightenment period in the 16th and 17th centuries, we reached the period where many people, many educated people, challenged the idea of revealed truth and instead began to emphasize the idea of man's reason and began to argue that the only pursuit of truth was through the use and the application of common sense, of reason. In other words, what we have here is not revealed truth, but rational truth. Truth that makes sense. Truth that answers questions. Truth that is logical. Truths that man's reason would logically make available or make clear to him. And then we have the idea of truth in the minds of some people being defined as fact. But the difference is, fact is truth only to the extent that it can be verified by others. Fact is not something that you by yourself, all alone, can prove. What makes fact fact is the fact that other people can validate it, can verify it, can speak to its accuracy. But as she points out, the reality is that truth very easily morphs or transposes into opinion. And that's kind of where I think we need to end this. I noticed that we've reached the top of the hour, the end of our program. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We've run a little bit late, a minute or so over today, and I apologize for that. Have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and thank you.